Hello and welcome to my final election prediction video. In this video we'll be going through the whole of the electoral map and look at especially the gray states here, the still toss-up states, the swing states, and we'll take a look at what the polls say about these states. And yeah, I'll be using Real Clear Politics as my source. I'll be only and mainly using polls. I will also use the 2016 polls as a reference to see if there were some errors, if there was a bias, if a state was characterized wrong at that time. And I will not be using any early voting statistics from these states, as I do not consider these to be a very good way of looking at the outcome of the election. I will not get into the details of why, but I will not use them to indicate where the state is going. I will also not be using the demographics of the states, as I myself do not know enough about all of these states and their demographics. And I'll also not consider states moving together. So when people often consider one state going into a certain direction, then other states will follow too, which is of course a true thing that is happening, but I again do not know much about that. I know the polls, I've read a lot about the polls in the past weeks, but I do not know so much about this effect of moving together that I can make my prediction based on that. Okay, so I have also done an election tool that I quickly need to explain, as I'll be using it in the video as well. So it can show several states, and it shows the polls with the respective error bars given by the institutes and the days until election. So the polls down here are the most are the latest polls. These ones are almost 30 days old. And we can select the time period, which is the gray shaded area, in which we want the polls to be taken into the average, that is the blue Gaussian curve here. We can also select the time. We can also shift the gray bar upwards, and we can do several things. We can introduce a 2016 bias, which is, well, just add the error that this state had in 2016, and we can highlight polls, which are either polls from institutes that Trump likes or retweets often, or that were fairly close in 2016, which mostly includes Rasmussen, the Trafalgar Group, and some other institutes. This whole tool will be available to download. The download link will be in the description of this video, so take a look there. You can download it. It's ready to use. It will you will get all the data with it, and you can just start using it. And finally, there's an option to also double the error of this Gaussian curve in case you think that these error bars given by the institutes are not correct. Well, so let's get into what I think are still problems. I do not think that these error bars are the biggest problems. I do not think that statistical effects are the main problem. I do think that systematic errors are the problems. When in certain states the distribution of voters that is asked about who they will vote for is not does not fit the people who are actually going to vote. If people don't answer honestly or do not take part because they have lost trust in the polls, especially since 2016. So there are several reasons why polls could be systematically off that I will not get into detail, but that one should take into account of, and which is also why even doubling an error or doing all these kinds of stuff is not the right way to look at it, as I do not think that we have statistical problems in polls, but more systematic problems. And of course there's the discussion, have polls gotten worse or better since 2016, with people arguing that the institutes have improved and learned from 2016, and with people also saying that people have lost trust in the polls since 2016, so it's actually gotten worse. So both is possible. We will actually only see after the election what, well, was true. But so much about my election tool, so much about what I base my prediction. Let's get into the Real Clear Politics 2020 election map. So this is their map characterized on what states they consider toss-up or likely or lean Democrat or Republican. I will use this state as a base, as I do not have time to go to the 50 states plus districts plus Washington. And characterize them. I will just consider these gray states here as the ones we'll be interested in, with the exception of Nebraska's 2nd and Maine 2nd district. To save time, I will just use for these ones, I will just use the result from Real Clear Politics and go through all of the other states together with you. Now, one thing we need to consider is many people have already voted. This is the map highlighting the voter turnout as fraction of 2016 turnout. In Texas, 108% of the people who voted in 2016 have already voted. Now, Texas generally does not have the highest turnout, so this is not a huge turnout still. But in general, we can see that in many states, turnout has already reached 2016 levels or is even beyond it. There are some exceptions, especially in the very important Rust Belt that is going to be very decisive for this election, especially Pennsylvania, where there is no in-person early voting, only with mail ballots. Turnout is still only at 40%. So here, especially election day is going to be important for the outcome of the actual election. Whereas in other states like Texas, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, but also other states like Nevada, we also have to consider when looking at the polls that over the past 1, 2, or 3 weeks, many people have already voted. So if the polls change, their votes are still the same. So we need to keep this in mind, that even if Trump has catched up, for example, in the last few days, if votes have already been cast by millions of people and by a large fraction, that needs to be taken account of, because then even catching up in the last week does not make a much of a difference. So we need to keep this in count. And just for the total statistics, 100 million people have voted so far, with election day, which is today, not being counted towards that. And that means 72% of the total turnout of 2016, and with especially young voters being significantly more active in this election than 2016. So we can definitely expect a higher turnout in total than in 2016. Okay, so let's go to Real Clear Politics and look at their final election no toss-up map. And, spoilers alert, my map is going to look identical, which is not because I just believe Real Clear Politics with everything, we go through it state by state, but just that I finally draw the same conclusions. So they end up with a 319 to 219 victory for Biden. While I of course know that many of these races are very narrow, so it's very likely that at least 1 or 2 or 3 states are going to be wrong, I do think this is a decent prediction for the states as based on the current polling data. Now, this has changed a couple of times in the past days, with Arizona going back to Biden, but then also several states going to Trump, and the lead going down from 350 down to 319, where it is right now. Now, to make the point a bit stronger, let's actually look at how the election map looked in 2016. In 2016, Real Clear Politics predicted 272 votes for Clinton and 266 for Trump. While this was off from the actual result by 40 votes, not taking into account faithless electors, but taking really what the people voted for, they were wrong in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. These states had very narrow result, and especially in the case of Wisconsin, and also a little bit in the case of Michigan and Pennsylvania, wrong polls. So these polls were wrong, but also these results were quite narrow. And, oops, now it's refreshing. So these end up with 46 additional votes for Trump, but they also made a mistake in Nevada, giving it to Trump when it actually voted for Clinton in 2016. So, if people say that the polls were really wrong in 2016, they most likely looked at websites saying Clinton has a 70 or 80% chance at winning, which I, in general, while I will still do it in this video, do not consider as the best way to look an election, because in the end of the day, we really need these electoral votes, and if polls are only slightly wrong, then these probabilities given are just nonsense, and they do not tell us a lot anymore. So actually, the predictions were fairly okay when taking into account that the states which were wrong, only one of them, only Wisconsin, is the only state in 2016 which was predicted wrong but had a margin higher than 5% for Clinton. Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Nevada were much closer. Still not good, but it was not so wrong as many portray it from 4 years ago. Now, we can also actually look at the Senate from 2016, which was predicted like this. It was wrong by one vote, and by 3 states. They predicted Pennsylvania wrong, they predicted Wisconsin wrong, but in the other way around, they predicted New Hampshire wrong when it actually went to the Democrats. In the end, Republicans had 52 and Democrats had 48. So these polls generally are fairly okay, but there are still mistakes, especially when there are narrow races. So let's actually also look at the Senate quickly, because we will not get into the Senate more in depth in this video. Here, Real Clear Politics currently predicts a tie of 50-50 for Democrats and Republicans. And we should keep in mind, in the case of a tie, the tiebreaker is the vice president. So then the presidential election is even more important, as the president of 2021 and going forward will have the vice president with him, in this case either Mike Pence or Kamala Harris, and this person will be the tiebreaker in the Senate if it ends up with a 50-50 vote. Okay, so enough about this. Let's get back to our state-by-state comparison. Look at what I have to say about the states, look at what the polls say, and then make my final conclusions about this election. Okay, so let's start with the state of Florida. Currently, Real Clear Politics sees Biden ahead by 0.9%. In 2016, Trump won this state by 1.2%, being 1% ahead of the polls. So polls in Florida have been quite accurate, with 1% being fairly okay. And if we go back to older elections, we see that Florida in general is quite accurate. Now, if you look at all of the results, we see that in general, most of the polls are in favor of Biden, but only with a very narrow margin. But with this institute Susquehanna, I don't know how to pronounce this, Trafalgar and Fox 35, of which at least Trafalgar is a very is one of the institutes that were correct in like Michigan in 2016, and that I also consider Trump polls, indicating a Trump win. So at the moment, if we look at Florida, we see that Biden is ahead. If we introduce the 2016 era again, we see that Trump is a little bit ahead, which makes sense. He's ahead by 0.9%, and Trump was 1% ahead of the polls. So what do I think about Florida? Well, a lot of people have already been voted, so we can't just take the current polls. So we just need to take a look at basically a lot of the polls from the past. And if we go back, actually not much has changed. It has been a bit more towards Biden, so it actually has narrowed up over the past couple of days. But keeping in mind that many people have already voted, and that this 2016 bias is not like going to happen in this way again. Florida is generally fairly accurate, has good polls, and they were have been wrong into both directions in the past. So I actually do think Florida will go to Biden, or actually is a little bit more likely to go to Biden. I think both candidates have a very good chance of winning Florida, with maybe Biden having a 55% chance and Trump having a 45% chance. But as it currently stands, looking at the data that we have, Florida is, wrong party, Democrat. I will highlight it with light blue to indicate that this is not one of the solid states, but one of the states we have gone through. So this, so much about Florida. Let's go to the next state in this order, which is Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania had polls wrong by about 2.6%, which is much worse than Florida, but still not a complete disaster. But taking a look at how much Biden is leading right now, he's actually leading less than Clinton did 4 years ago. So we can see this here. Trump is actually in Pennsylvania. Trump is actually ahead by 0.7% compared to Clinton were, and Clinton lost the state. If we take a look at the polls, we see that especially the Trump polls, Susquehanna, Trafalgar, or Insider Advantage predict a Trump win. And if we look at Pennsylvania here, we see that almost all of the polls see Biden winning by a solid margin. If we introduce the 2016 bias, still Biden would win if we take these polls. Now, where's the difference to RCP? RCP does not take polls twice if they are from the same institute, and they throw out polls after a much quicker time. We can also do that, so go down here and we will end up with a similar result where Pennsylvania narrows up or sees even Trump ahead with the 2016 error. In generally, I still think that Biden will win Pennsylvania, but it's one of the states where I am, especially from the Rust Belt, where I have we're really like not sure about it, especially since Clinton was leading by a larger margin at that point, and since most of the votes will be cast on election day. So far, less than 40% of the turnout has been reached in Pennsylvania, as there is no in-person early voting in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, as I do think, is very much toss-up. Trump has a very good chance to win there, but I still think Biden has a small edge in Pennsylvania and is a little bit more likely to win there. So, saying that, I will actually do this with just like Florida, because they're both very close, a bit brighter blue. And we'll get going with the next state, which is Wisconsin. Wisconsin had a incredibly wrong polls. They were wrong by 7.2%. And if we go to the 2016 data and look at them, there was no institute being actually close to predicting a Trump win. Now, in the past, Wisconsin has been predicted within 1 or 2%, especially when Obama won. So it's not that that happens all the time, but we see that in 2016, basically no one got Wisconsin even somewhat right. So we have to look at that even when we look at the 2020 polling data. Now, the funny thing is, Trafalgar, which claims to take into account these effects of people not trusting the polls anymore, even Trafalgar sees Biden ahead by 1%, which is the narrowest of all of these polls. Now, looking at it in our diagram, well, Trafalgar is this point here, with another tie being on the list further down here, but that one is also from a institute which has a, well, let's say a Republican bias or a bias towards not doing it the same way that then the so-called mainstream media does it. So, Wisconsin, if we just take the normal polls, Biden has a solid lead. But if you take into account the 2016 bias, things look very different. So in Wisconsin, things very heavily depend upon if the polls are as wrong as they were in 2016 or not. If they were as wrong, it's going to be, again, a very narrow race. And again, many people are still going to vote today, as turnout is around 50-60% in Wisconsin. So again, Wisconsin, I can't just say I think it's going to be as wrong again and that, well, that Trump is going to win it. If you compare it with 2016, Biden is at the same point where Clinton is. So if things turn out the same way as 2016, Trump will win this state. But as I do not think that especially these institutes specializing in this state and doing their polls there are going to do the same mistakes. But again, we will know on election day. But for now, I will predict Wisconsin going for Trump, going for Biden, and actually going for Biden with a larger fraction than these two states. But again, it depends very heavily if we see such an incredible polling error again. All right, so that brings us to the next state, which is North Carolina. Now, in North Carolina, currently Trump is leading the RCP average by a small margin. But again, Trump also won this state 2.7% ahead of the polls. Now, in our tool, we can always see this by the red. This is wrong state, North Carolina. We can see this by red cross, which is the poll average, and the black dot being the actual result. So if we introduce the 2016 bias again, Trump is incredibly safe in North Carolina. If we just look at their actual polls, well, things are interesting, as the race has definitely gone a bit in favor of Trump. There were almost no polls seeing Trump ahead, well, 4 weeks ago, but if we just look at the past couple of 2 weeks, then Biden only has a small lead, and especially if you take 2016 bias, he has no chance. So if we reduce the polls and go just to the last couple of days, then it actually looks towards in favor of Trump. Now, for North Carolina, around 95% of turnout has already voted. Still, I think that Trump will win this state, just like the RCP average is showing us, since I think Trump has catched up a lot in this state. It might seem unreasonable why I characterize this state as pro Trump, even though this way is going here. well, I do think that we are too close within the 2016 era. With Wisconsin, the game was a bit different because we are very far away, and with 2016 bias, we are barely at a tie, whereas in North Carolina, with the 2016 bias, Trump has a very solid margin, I would say, or a margin where we can say he will carry this state. So that's why I will give North Carolina towards Trump, while knowing that Biden still has a good chance of winning the state. It's still toss-up, as is the case with most of these states. So we'll characterize North Carolina with this color. All right, that brings us to the next state, which is Michigan. Michigan had a 3.7% polling error in 2016, but Biden is leading even a bit more than Clinton did. Not a lot, but 0.6% as it stands today. And in Michigan, a lot of people are still going to vote. Right now, turnout is only at 60%. So, if we ignore Trafalgar, which is predicting a Trump win, almost all of the polls see Biden ahead. Only Trafalgar, which is this one of the Trump polls, sees Trump ahead in Michigan. I do think that especially over the past weeks, Biden has had a significantly better lead than Clinton. So especially he was ahead with up to 2% compared to Clinton. And in general, I think Michigan is one of the states which will go back to Biden. Michigan was won by Trump by an incredibly small margin of, in total, just 10,000 votes. I think Michigan will go for Biden, but again, Michigan, while the polls see it very much in favor of Biden with 4%, things could still be very wrong if the error is very wrong again. So let's take it Michigan. This is with the 2016 error. This is without it. So even with 2016 error, Michigan, for me, seems very much solid for Biden, as most of these polls here on the right are, well, the Trump polls that they only do it correct, but then again, you have to also see their biases as well. So Michigan currently, I think, is actually, from all of the states in the Rust Belt, the one which I see is most safe, because for once it had the smallest margin in 2016. It does not have such a large polling error than Wisconsin, and also it has fairly good polls. So out of these three states, I actually consider Michigan to be like one step more solid than these two states. Okay, so Michigan is a bit more safe. So let's get going and let's do the next state, which is Ohio. Ohio has predicted the winner of the presidency for all elections since John F. Kennedy's 1960 win. So Ohio always elected a president which also later won the presidency. This year it seems like Trump is going to win Ohio, even though things also seem that Biden will win the presidency. So Ohio seems to lose its 60-year streak of predicting the outcome of the election, as Trump is leading here, but also things are still narrow. These are two polls very heavily in favor of Trump, while we also had polls going 4% in favor of Biden. Ohio generally has very, very few polls, so it's very hard to make a prediction right here. But Ohio was also fairly wrong in 2016. As we can see here, Trump won by 8%, even though RCP only predicted 3.5%. So even Ohio had a large polling error. Then, if you just remove the bias, then it's more toss-up. But still, I think Ohio will go for Trump. In Ohio, a lot of people are still going to vote in person today. So if Trump catches up here, like the polling data has shown consistently, then many people are going to turn out today and vote for Trump, which is why I think Ohio will go for Trump. But again, it could be a bit narrow. Now, finally, one thing that I want to know, if you look at 2016, which is a bit interesting, is that Emerson predicted a 7% lead in favor of Trump. So they won and Trump won in the end by 8%. So Emerson was fairly close. Funny enough, in 2016, they actually see Biden ahead by 1%. So things are very weird in Ohio, and I do not really think what's going to happen there. But looking at the polls, I do think that Trump has a fairly good chance, since lots of people are still going to vote. He's a bit ahead in the total RCP average. And in general, well, both candidates have a good shot of Ohio, but I will give Ohio to Donald Trump. Next state on our list is Minnesota. Minnesota had very few polls in 2016 as it was considered fairly close. In the end, Clinton only won it by 1.5%. I'm going to show it to you right now. So there were just a few polls. Look at this. Those were the only 2 polls which were in the month before the election. And they saw Clinton up by 10%. So Minnesota was also, it were very, very small sample sizes and very few polls. So in the end, this RCP didn't even calculate an RCP average from this data. At the moment, Minnesota, they have fairly increased the number of polls, so they're now like 5 polls in just of 2, and they see Biden consistently leading. Even Trafalgar Group sees Biden consistently leading, so I have no doubts right now that Biden is going to win Minnesota, so I will carry it as fairly safe in the same kind of way as Michigan. And we can also look at this here. No, I don't have Minnesota here. Okay, great. So this brings us to the next state, which is Iowa. In Iowa, Trump is ahead in the polls by 2%, and with the exception of one polling institute, past polls have consistently shown Trump being ahead, with Biden only having a lead if go back more than 1 or 2 weeks. And we need to keep in mind, in Iowa, still a lot of people are going to vote in person today. So Iowa, I will give it to Trump, as he has been catching up a lot in the polls over the past days, actually quite a lot. So a lot of undecided voters are going for Trump, and that's why I will give Iowa in favor of Trump, but we can also look at it here. Iowa had an enormous polling error in 2016. I think that is one of the largest at all. So it went in favor of Trump by 9.5. So it was wrong by 6.5%. So actually not as bad as Wisconsin, but still very bad. So if we give the 2016 bias, then, well, Biden can say goodbye. If polls are good again, Trump will still win, which is why I do not see any way how Biden can win Iowa. Even with polls being much, much better than 4 years ago, Trump is still on the path to win right now. So right now it stands at 302 to 165. So Biden already has won if this is the electoral map. Also because I have considered him to win Florida, and we have not yet talked about Texas and Georgia. But right now Biden would have already won the presidency, but we'll go on anyway. So next state on our list is Arizona. Arizona has been a very strong lead for Biden, but it has been catching up quite a lot significantly. But also Arizona, most of the people have already voted. We need to take this into account. So even if even if Biden is ahead just by a small margin, which is actually much better than Clinton, so he's leading the Clinton value by 5%. So he's doing much, much better than Clinton did in 2016. And actually polls were in favor of Trump, the only state where they were in favor of Trump that we're going to take a look at. So actually I think Biden will win Arizona as it stands today. While some institutes see Trump ahead, the polls were fairly accurate in 2016. And Biden has been consistently leading in these polls, especially in the last week. And even though Trump has catched up, most people have already cast their vote. So I will give Arizona to Joe Biden with a okay to maybe a bit narrow margin. So Arizona is kind of narrow, so I will not put it in the same column as Minnesota and Michigan. We'll quickly take a look here what my prediction says. So with the normal way, it looks like this, and with 2016 bias, it even moves a bit to the left because the polls were wrong in favor of Trump. Then again, if you only take a look at the last couple of days, it moves not really significantly towards Trump. So that's why I will classify Arizona as it stands today. And with this final prediction before the election, I will predict it in favor of Joe Biden. Going on, there is just a few states left. Nevada, Biden is leading. He's leading by a small margin. And if you look at 2016, polls were wrong by a large margin in favor of Trump. So they predicted a Trump win by 1%, Clinton won by 2.4%. So I take back that actually Arizona was the only state. No, Nevada had a significant polling error in favor of Trump too. Which is why I think Biden will carry the state, since Biden had a consistent lead compared to. So basically, all the polls seem in advantage, even with the exception of the most current Trafalgar poll. But again, this poll is very recent, and in Nevada, already 96% have voted, which is why Nevada is a fairly safe bet. Can't make it completely blue because those are the solid states, but it's one of the most safe states in this election of those which are still considered toss-up, which with probably being similar than Minnesota. All right, so that brings us to the final two states, which are Texas and Georgia. Texas had a 16% win for Romney in 2012, a 9% win for Trump in 2016, and now it is down in the polls to just 1.2%. So Republicans have lost significantly over the past years in Texas. Now, every reasonable polling institute still sees Trump ahead between 1 and 7%, with one exception here for Biden free. But in general, Trump is still ahead in Texas. And if I don't have Texas here in my polling thing, but we generally see that while Trump has been losing over the past days, lots of people in Texas have actually been voting over the past weeks. So not many people are actually going to vote at election day anymore. But in general, Trump has been ahead in Texas. But I do think Texas is going to be a lot more tight. So Texas is going to... Well, we do have a lot more polls now in 2016, 25, because it was considered so safe. It was a lot safer, but will going to be at a historic low. Trump will win it, but he will not win it by 9%. I think he will win it more like 1, 2, or 3, or 4%. All right, so that brings us to the last state, which is Georgia. Wrong side. Georgia, which Trump won in 2016 by 5% and Romney by 8%, is now much more toss-up. While the latest few polls have seen Trump surging from 46 to 48%, and Trump leading quite a lot, Georgia also had a lot of vote in the past, but still, because the race was in favor of Trump in the past and only for a very brief time Biden was actually leading, I will give this state to Donald Trump, and we'll quickly take a look at my polling tool. That Georgia is in fairly toss-up. 2016 polls and 2016 result were almost identical, so polls were fairly correct. There were actually no Trump polls in this sense currently in Georgia, so most of them are institutes which do not really have a bias in one direction. So basically we see Georgia is very toss-up. I will still give it to Donald Trump because he was ahead in these most recent polls that I have not yet included here, which are here down in this column. So Georgia, I will give it to Trump, but I recognize that Biden has a very realistic chance of winning Georgia because it is very much toss up. So this is the electoral map that I end up 319 to 219, which is exactly the electoral map from RCP, Real Clear Politics. So we agree basically on the current stand of the election, how it currently stands for Donald Trump and Joe Biden. So this predicts a Biden win, a okay but not extremely huge Biden win. But now I will introduce actually my 4 election scenarios. So this is the election map that, based on the polls, I am going to give you. But there are 4 scenarios which I think are possible. One scenario which I think has a 15% chance of happening is a strong Trump win. What I mean with strong Trump win is basically a 2016 redraw. He wins Florida. But he also wins Arizona, and he wins basically the whole of the Rust Belt. That's the best he can do right now, which is when he will end up, together with Nebraska's 2nd district, at the same result as 2016. I still think that he will not win Michigan, so I think Michigan is lost for him. But a 2016 redraw or something close to a 2016 redraw is actually the best Trump can do right now. He cannot improve significantly on his result. So this is one scenario which I give a only 15% chance. A much higher chance of about a third actually would be a narrow Trump win. For me, this means that he does not really win a lot in the Rust Belt, but he do wins in Florida, which is very much possible. It's very toss-up. And he also wins in Arizona, but Michigan still goes for the Democrats. Pennsylvania still goes for the Democrats. But then Trump either narrowly wins like this, or he wins Pennsylvania, but maybe loses Wisconsin, and still narrowly wins. So he wins one state in the Rust Belt. He wins Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona. This would be a narrow Trump win. So Trump does not need to win the entire Rust Belt. One state of the Rust Belt can be enough for him if he wins Florida, if he wins Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. So this is, I think, his most likely pathway to winning this election. The third scenario is a narrow Biden win. What I mean with narrow Biden win is that basically Biden just wins the Rust Belt back. So he doesn't win Arizona, he doesn't win Florida, but he keeps the Rust Belt, giving him 278. So basically, he wins back the Rust Belt, but everything else goes in favor of Trump. But that still would be enough to win the election with 278 to 260. Not taking into account these small changes here with the districts for Nebraska and Maine. This, I think, has also a quite likely chance of happening, with about 35% chance of happening. And then I give, finally, for the fourth scenario, about a 20% chance that Biden wins solid, which means he will also carry Arizona and he will also carry Florida, and he still has a chance of actually carrying Georgia and North Carolina. So between 349 and 318, so somewhere between 300 in general and 360 is a solid Biden win, which I think has a 20% chance of happening, where he wins not only the Rust Belt back, but also these states like Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona, at least wins one or two of these states. So these are my four scenarios, and in general, this means I still think Biden has a 55% chance of winning, Trump has a 45% chance winning. So things are narrow, both candidates have a good shot of winning the election right now. Now, what are we going to see tonight? I do not think that we will see the winner of the election, but Florida and North Carolina have announced that they will announce the election result of all the votes at the regular time, which will be at Germany somewhat at 4 or 5 a.m. in the night. So Florida and North Carolina, if they were to be announced to go both in favor of Joe Biden, that would pretty much call the race. Even if Trump won Arizona, even if we won Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, he was still not winning the election. So if we see these two states going in favor of Biden, which is not impossible, especially in Florida, and with some chance also not happening, some chance also possible in North Carolina, then the election would be over actually basically on election day, because chances are pretty slim for Trump to then change it. So this is the only outcome where I see the winner being actually, not 100% safe, but where we have a good chance of seeing who wins the election at the night. If Trump carries Florida, which he basically needs to win the election, if Trump wins Florida, then I do not think that we will see the election winner, as especially states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin in the Rust Belt have announced that it will take them a long time to count the ballots, and in these states ballots will actually also be counted if they arrive after election, so they will still continue receiving ballots and counting if the coming days after election. So if it comes down to the Rust Belt, we will have to wait a couple of days, maybe even a week or longer, to see the final election result. It's going to become a very much political mess. So this was my 2020 election video. It's been a long video, so I hope you could still follow me up until this point. You have seen my election prediction based on the polls. Now I want to give one election prediction which is more like what I think from my gut. So it's more like what I would maybe bet, but it's not what the polls say. I think, well, basically what my gut thinks is that actually Trump will actually win Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, and the Democrats will win the Rust Belt, which is what I said is a narrow Biden win. So this is more what I consider, what I bet on, is a 278 to 260 more narrow win. Still, polls actually see Biden ahead by more, but that is what my gut tells me, and what basically, what I would, if I would go to spend money to bet on the outcome of the election, this is what I would spend it on. Of roughly this outcome, maybe some changes in Nebraska's and Maine's 2nd district. Alright, this has been it for the election prediction. So first states are going to be announced, are going to be called at 1 a.m. in Germany tonight, and then we might see some interesting results from Florida, North Carolina, and some other states within this night, but most likely the election is going to continue for the coming days and maybe even for an entire week. So thanks for watching, and if you want, you can download my polling tool in the video description. You need to have Python and Matplotlib installed to run it. I will also put a link how you can do that there. So thanks for watching. This is my election prediction video, and I hope you also watch the election live. If not, then you will all get some interesting news and results tomorrow morning.